This is a joint presentation with colleagues from the Migrant Life project. As Anna said, the project is funded by the European Research Council. And what is the aim today? The aim is really to try to give you an overview of a selection of research conducted in the course of this project. And first, here you see our team, or you see people who have contributed to the project. Of course, some people have moved on already, and I'm very pleased about that. So they have been promoted to various jobs, but some people have recently joined and working hard on the project, and most people have then contributed to the results I'm going to show you, or at least the selection of results I'm going to show you. So let me begin with the background of the project and our research. As we all know, the share of immigrants has increased in most European countries in the last decades. Southern European countries experienced particularly rapid increase in the first decade of this century. This figure is about the share of immigrants in Europe in 2019, so just before the COVID pandemic spread. We see that in most Western, Northern and Southern European countries, the share of immigrants varies between 10 and 20%. So the share is lower in Eastern Europe, but of course also growing there. The number of descendants of immigrants has also increased. It is difficult to obtain precise figure, but for example, for the UK, we know that immigrants and their descendants formed about 1/5 of the population in 2011, which was a census year. So we have some preliminary results also from 2021 census, and this seems to be around 25%. And this figure is relatively similar to similar for those European countries which were destinations of post-World War II labor migration. So what do we know about immigrants, especially their family, which is the focus of much demographic research? Well, we know that there is a lot of heterogeneity in family patterns. So this figure shows the distribution of immigrants from Caribbean countries and those from Pakistan and Bangladesh. In the UK by partnership status and age. These are cohorts born between 1950 and 1969. As you see, at age 15, everyone is single. And by age 40, we see that for immigrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh, most people are married. There are virtually neither cohabitants nor separated individuals among this group. Some people are still single indeed. By contrast, if we look at immigrants from Caribbean countries, we see specific patterns. Clearly, there is much more heterogeneity here. By age 40, indeed, the largest group is those who are married, but there are many who are singles and also those who are cohabiting, who have experienced separation and also a divorce, if we distinguish these two. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in family patterns. Well, this also leads to our main question behind the project. So what is the main question? So we're interested in whether the observed patterns or this heterogeneity I showed you, whether these patterns are short-term outcomes or a temporary phenomena in a long process of cultural and economic integration, or rather a sign of segmentation of our societies. So in other words, different trajectories and outcomes for immigrants and their descendants. So we can speak about convergence versus divergence idea here. Our research is very much inspired by two competing approaches to immigrant integration. The classical assimilation approach assumed that over time and generations, immigrants and minority populations become increasingly similar to the native population, ultimately becoming indistinguishable from them. Although most recent studies in Europe use the notion of integration instead of assimilation, integration is normally perceived as a process in which immigrant values and behaviors converge towards the average of the host society. So in contrast, the segmented assimilation approach states that immigrants and their descendants adopt different integration pathways. Certain groups experience cultural and economic integration into the middle class and upward social mobility. Other groups assimilate into the underclass. So they experience cultural assimilation, but this is not coupled with socioeconomic or structural integration. And one example here is, or a classical example here, are Mexicans in the US. Finally, a fraction of migrant and minority groups experience economic integration into the middle class, but experience a delayed acculturation, resulting in the preservation of the immigrants' cultural characteristics. And here, a classical example is provided by the Jewish population in the US. Okay, this is a bit background. In terms of wider background, the wider research question. So what is the more specific focus of the project? So the more specific focus is on three main life domains. So these are family, employment, and housing. We analyze these and also make some projections for the in terms of future developments. So we study immigrants and also their descendants in mostly 4 European countries, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger numbers. So these are UK, France, Germany, and Sweden. So which population subgroups are included in the analysis? The groups are as follows. First, the largest or the main immigrant groups in each country, for example, South Asians or Caribbeans in the UK, or those from Turkey and Morocco in France, or those from Turkey in Germany. And second, we also investigate the descendants of immigrants, or so-called second generation. So how do we approach individuals' lives or their life trajectories? And this is a kind of complex figure I want to show you, and it illustrates at least where we start from. You see here this consists of states and transition between the states or life events, and we have here a combined figure of partnerships and childbearing trajectories. And you see that individuals from single can move to cohabitation or married, or they can have a child, and all changes what happen vertically represent changes in partnership status, and everything what happens horizontally represent changes in child pairing. So individuals can be in any partnership changes, and this with different parity. Well, let me now show you a selection of the results, and I'm going to start with family. So, and I begin with the UK, and then also show some results on other countries. And again, I'm going to show you the the same graph in a little bit different format, but just to tell us what we're going to do. And this bubble here illustrates the first step of our analysis. At age 16, everyone is single and never partnered, single, never partnered, and childless, and they can move they can cohabit or marry without cohabitation, or then have a child outside of union. And once they are cohabiting, then they have options to move different states, and from marriage, then you can move to have a child, separate. These two options are there. So, and these competing transitions are then modeled. These transitions are modeled as competing risk within a multi-state framework, and individuals can experience these sets of competing transitions several times. Right, okay, let's now go to the results. So this figure shows then transitions out of singlehood among women in the UK. So the bubble I just showed you. Transition rates of never partnered individuals for all groups are relative to one reference point, which is a transition to marriage among the native population. So all rates are compared to that. So what do we see? We see that native women are most likely to cohabit, followed by marrying directly and then having a birth outside of union. So we see that the patterns are very similar for immigrants from other European countries. In contrast, immigrants from South Asia marry without prior cohabitation. Cohabitation is thus uncommon among these groups. Interestingly, if you look at Caribbeans, you see also specific patterns here. So they have relatively low cohabitation and marriage rate. Many of them have a child while never partnered. Okay, what about patterns across migrant generations? Interestingly, as you see, the patterns among the descendants are relatively similar to those of immigrants. So South Asians, you see these bars here, exhibit high marriage and low exhibition rates. However, marriage rates among them are lower, suggesting that there is a postponement of marriages among the descendant group. And you also see that childbearing among never partnered individuals is common among the population of Caribbean origin. Well, let me now show you what happens when individuals are married. I'm going to skip the outcomes of cohabitation for the sake of time. So this figure shows the transition of married individuals to birth or separation. So we see that the propensity of having a child among partnered individuals is much higher than separate, and this is, of course, not surprising. There is some variation across migrant groups. We see that immigrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh have higher birth rates, and this suggests two things here. Remember, we're modeling here all transitions. So this suggests two things: early and universal childbearing among these groups. So this is the first birth, and also larger families, in other words, transition to a third birth. In contrast, immigrants from Caribbean countries have higher or relatively high separation rates. So what about migrant generation? Again, moving right, we see that birth rates among the second generation are similar to the natives. There is some variation and a little bit higher rates we see among those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi descent. Right, so far what we have done, we have compared transition rates across migrant groups, but I also want to show you how these rates translate into the distribution of states state spaces by age. And what we have done, we have used these rates as an input for microsimulation, and then we have simulated respective populations. And now I'm going to show you the distribution of these populations by state spaces and age. So the first group are the native population. So what you see, what you expect at age 20, most people are still single and childless, and by age 50, most natives are married and have 1, 2, or 3 children. So these are actually a little bit older cohorts. If we move on, and then now we see Pakistani immigrants and their descendants by family status. So you see clearly different patterns. If you look at immigrants, you see that by age 50, most are married and have also children, and many have actually 3 children. If you look at the patterns among the descendants, so we see relatively similar patterns in terms of the prevalence of marriage, virtually no cohabitation, but we also see some changes. So there are more those who have experienced separation, and also fertility, some fertility decline. In other words, the share of people who have 3 children is smaller. And now we see Caribbeans. And this is already what we saw when I started at the beginning of my presentation. And we see this heterogeneity again among immigrants. So, but interestingly, if you look at the descendants, so you see that the patterns are even more heterogeneous. Well, this was about Britain. Let me now also include migrant groups from France and Germany in the analysis, and just show you also our research focus, because we are doing here a comparative study. Then we really model, we have a little bit simplified our approach. So we model 2 stages of individual's life course. First, we analyze competing transitions out of singlehood, and then we look what happens when people are in union, not only married, but all unions. Okay, and here are the selection of results. As I said, first we look at transitions out of singlehood in 3 countries. And to facilitate comparison, what we have done here, we have produced a separate graph for each migrant generation. However, the transition rates of never partnered individuals for all these groups are relative to 1 reference point, which is a transition to marriage among the native population in the UK. So this allows us to make a bigger comparison, even things are not just on 1 graph here. Okay, so what do we see? We start from natives and immigrants. We see that in all 3 countries, native men and women, both are here, are most likely to cohabit, followed by marrying directly and then having a child outside of union. And the same patterns of course, we already know for the UK, for France, and also for Germany. So we distinguish East and West Germany here as well. So what about migrants? So in all 3 countries, cohabitation is also common among immigrants from other European countries. And you see Europe and Western here. We know already other Europe here. Yes, Southern Europe a little bit different, and we see also Southern Europe here different, but Poland perhaps has slightly higher marriage rates here. But overall, quite similar pictures. But what we clearly see that by contrast, immigrants from South Asia to the UK, what we already know, those from North Africa and Turkey to France, and those from Turkey and Russia, Kazakhstan in Germany have very high cohabitation rates and low marriage rates. So what about migrant generations? And this is the next figure overall. So this is so-called 1.5 generation, or individuals who arrived as children. And we see relatively similar patterns to those of immigrants. Also, we observe some spread of cohabitation among those who arrived as children. And if we move to descendants, interestingly, the patterns are also relatively similar here. Again, you see that South Asians and those from in the UK and those from Turkey in France and Germany have a relatively high marriage and low cohabitation rates. However, we see some increase in the cohabitation among the descendants, and also, of course, we see that the marriage rates are much lower among those groups, still mostly marrying directly, which suggests that the postponement of marriages is quite important trend among the descendant population. Nevertheless, the similarity of pathways to union and family formation across migrant generation is striking in all three countries. Right, and so let's also have a look at the patterns when individuals are in union, and we look at the transition to third birth or large families, just focusing on one transition here, or actually two transitions, but one important stage of life. So we observe significant differences in the propensity of having a third child. So we see that immigrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh, what we already know, have relatively high rates, but also those from Africa and Turkey in France. And interestingly, those from Turkey in Germany have lower rates, but still higher than other groups in Germany. So what about migrant generations? So we go to the we go to the descendants directly here. And we see that the rates are lower among the second generation compared to immigrants. However, the levels are still high among the population of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, and those of African origin in France, and those of Turkish origin as well. Right, let me now sum up the main results on partnership patterns. So what we observe, first we observed significant diversity of partnership patterns and family forms among immigrants and their descendants. So we have the Caribbean population in the UK, Southern Europeans in France and Germany, and they all show relatively similar patterns to those of the native population. So many of them cohabit prior to marriage, some experience dissolution of their first union, some have a birth outside of a union, and their fertility levels are similar to those of the natives. In contrast, South Asians in the UK and Turkish population in France and Germany exhibit conservative family behavior. The patterns are thus different from those of the native population, so they have high marriage rates and low separation levels, and childbearing outside of marriage is uncommon. And many have 3 children, as we saw. And second, there are little differences between first and 1.5 generation. These are people who arrived as children. However, we observe some changes in second generation, the spread of cohabitation and separation, and also lower fertility levels. Right, this was about family fertility patterns or trajectories. Let me now move on to employment trajectories. And the main question is, how are family patterns related to employment? Again, what I'm going to do, I'm going to first show you the results on Britain and then also on other countries. And we're using a little bit different methods here, so I have no time to comment, but later if someone is interested in these, please feel free to questions. Feel free to ask questions. Apologies. Okay. What we have done here, we have classified migrants based on their partnership status, family size at arrival, and their employment and trajectories after migration. So the first group consists of individuals, and this is here, who were arrived in the UK as singles and childless, and they stayed also mostly in those states in the first 5 years after arrival, and then formed unions and children later, 5 to 10 years after migration. So this is not shown here. So the second group includes immigrants who arrived as single or partnered individuals, but experienced significant partnership changes during the first 2 to 3 years following migration. And the third group consists of migrants who were already married when they arrived in the UK, and they also came with children. So we have 3 groups in the UK, or at least we have done such a classification. What about the employment patterns of the 3 broad groups? Most individuals classified as single and childless, and this is now here. So they arrived in the UK to study as expected. The group shows very high share of students and also part-time workers. However, the share of students gradually declines as many become employed full-time after their studies. So among the partnered and childless category, so this is the second group, we see that full employment is the dominant category. Also, there are individuals who were part-time employed, and also some students within this group. And finally, the family migrant group, we see diversity here in terms of employment patterns. However, 2 categories dominate. Some people work full-time, but many have stayed out of the labor market, and this is this category color here. So which groups are more likely to belong to one of the 3 partnership and fertility groups? I show you determinants of the single and childless and family migrants. So these are the first 2 groups. So these are average marginal effects, as you see, and we've compared different variables here, but I just focus on gender and then also origin of the migrants. So what you clearly see, we see that women are significantly less likely to arrive as single and childless than men, and they are more likely to arrive as arrive as family migrants. In other words, to be married and have children at arrival. And this is not surprising, given that traditional labor migration-based family reunification has been an important trend in migration to the UK over the last decades. I'm not going to show other variables, just focusing on migrants' origin here. We have distinguished just EU and non-EU migrants, and we see that non-EU migrants are more likely to arrive as family migrants and less likely to arrive as single and childless than those who came from EU countries. Important thing here is, of course, the gender aspect, and this is, of course, as we have these clear differences, so we also conducted analysis by gender, and here are the results. And if we just focus on two graphs here, so in other words, employment patterns among family migrants, men are on the left and women are on the right. Clearly, we see that most men in the family migrant group work full-time, whereas women are not active in the labor market or in education. For migrant households, thus, there is a high likelihood that one of partners working, usually the man, and a woman staying at home. Right, this was about migrants, and I'm going to carry on with the same type of approach. When we are looking at descendants of immigrants. And I'm going to focus women only here. So this is a complex figure, but we go this through and perhaps focus on most important things. So this figure shows the results of sequence analysis, and we have done some clustering here based on individual sequences, and we have identified 5 types of joint trajectories of partnership, fertility, and employment among the descendants of immigrants, and also natives are actually included here. Right. Let me just briefly describe each cluster and also show you which groups are more likely or less likely to exhibit a certain type of behavior. So first 2 clusters, we can go fast. The first cluster is typical for older generation of the native population. So people become married, so they have up to 2 children. And they leave labor markets around childbearing, and then they return later and often part-time. So the second cluster is very similar, and this characterizes younger generations. It is similar, but everything is just happening later, or all events are postponed in the lives of individuals. The third cluster characteristic to this group is that partnerships happen even older ages, or there are no partnerships at all. And the same applies to childbearing, and these people are mostly working. And if we look now next who are more likely to belong to this group, we see that those of Caribbean descent and those who come from other or those who have parents from other European countries, so they are more likely to belong here, whereas those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin have lower likelihood to belong to this group. So the fourth group consists of women who form unions at young ages, similarly to group 2, one of these first groups, but it is more heterogeneous than these first 2 groups I showed you in terms of partnership and fertility patterns. And who are more likely to belong to that group? Clearly, you see that this group is has more, or Caribbeans are overrepresented in that group by 20% points relative to natives. And the fifth cluster is here, and characteristic to this group is early unions and marriages, and also earlier childbearing, and also large families. Many leave labor markets after studies. We start following individuals after studies or around the birth of first birth of their child, the latest, and only some return. So who belong to this group? We see clearly that women of Indian and also Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are overrepresented in this group. Right pictures is emerging from results I have shown you, but we somehow also have a question how to present this concisely and how to have kind of to sum up everything what we observed so far. So what we have done next, we have calculated time spent in employment across descendant groups using multi-state life tables. And what we have here, time spent in employment or time in activity and inactivity between ages 25 and 65, in other words, 40 years. And this we have calculated for different groups, and then we have on the left women and on the right we have men. So for natives, if we start and we look native men, we see that on average they spend 33 years or they are 33 years active between these ages, 25 or 65, or the window of 40 years and 7 years inactive. For women, these figures are 27 and 13. They spend less time on the labor market as expected. And if we now look at men overall, we see that the patterns are relatively similar across descendant groups and natives. Yes, there are some differences, but broadly they are similar. However, there is an important variation among women. We see that women of European, Indian, Caribbean, and African descent, they are mostly active, whereas those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are inactive. So in other words, you see very clear differences. And this is our attempt to sum up these things, what we have shown. Right. Let me sum up the main results on the UK, and then show you also a little bit about other countries, and then I can sum up everything once again. So what we then observed, we observed that the descendants of immigrants from Europe and other Western countries have family and employment trajectories similar to the native British population. Individuals of Caribbean origin have diverse family patterns, but these patterns do not translate to labor market disadvantage, at least the measures based on the measures we have used. And finally, third, women of Pakistani and Bangladeshi and also Indian descent exhibit conservative family patterns. These patterns are coupled with low employment levels for women of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin. Right, let me now also show the results from a comparative study. Lots of arrows and boxes here, but this shows what all we have tried to do. But what I'm just going to show you is to look at the risk of entering first employment, either after leaving a full-time education, this is for descendants and natives, or since migration for migrants. So this figure shows the results of the transition to first employment. On the left, we have immigrants, and on the right, we have descendants, and then we have UK, France, and Germany. So for immigrants, a reference group is here, or reference level is here, the rate for first generation immigrants from other European countries. And for descendants, so this is natives, right? The rate of entry to first employment here for natives. Okay, what we see first, we see a similar entry rates into employment among immigrants from Europe across the three countries. So broadly, relatively similar picture here you see. And we see also that Caribbeans have very similar levels. However, most other groups have lower levels of entry into first employment. So these are the those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, to some extent Indians also in the UK, and most groups in France, so North Africans, and those also of Turkish coming from Turkey in Germany. So differences are smaller among the descendants of immigrants, but descendants of immigrants. So we see that Europeans or South Europeans, descendants of Europeans, have a level similar to the native population for most cases. Still, those of Pakistani or Bangladeshi origin, in particular in the UK, and all groups in the France have lower likelihood of entering employment after full-time education. Women of Turkish origin, German, have higher levels, but still lower than the rest of the groups in Germany. Right, I presented just one graph on our comparative study, and this gives you at least the idea what the patterns might be here, if also considering the other transition. So in terms of exit of employment and re-entry. So let me now sum up the results. First, we found large differences between immigrant groups. South Asian women in the UK, those from Turkey and France and Germany, are less likely to enter employment and more likely to leave than those from other European countries or Caribbean region. Second, the differences are reduced among the descendants of the immigrants, but they still persist. And finally, labor market disadvantage stems from low levels of employment prior to childbearing, and also higher exit rates following childbearing. I see I have a couple of minutes left. Well, let me now return to the main question of the project, whether the observed patterns or heterogeneity observed among immigrants are short-term outcomes in a long-term process of cultural and economic integration, or rather a sign of segmentation of our societies. So in other words, different trajectories and outcomes for immigrants and their descendants. So based on all these studies, we could say that there is a gradual convergence happening, but heterogeneity is still there, especially for women. And let me reiterate how this looks at the group level, because this is quite important. So first, we have the descendants of immigrants from Europe and other Western countries. And clearly, they have very similar, or they have employment, family trajectory similar to the native population. So we really see integration or assimilation, whichever concept you wish to use. Second, we have individuals Caribbean origin, and they have diverse family patterns, but employment trajectories are similar to native. So we see certainly positive trends here, or at least patterns here. And third, we have individuals of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Turkish descent. They exhibit conservative family trajectories, and these patterns are coupled with low employment levels for women of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Turkish origin. But it is important still to remind us that we see some changes across generations, but the convergence is slower here, but the direction is clear in our opinion. So thank you very much indeed.